I need to tell you about the first time I laughed after Margaret died. Not a polite smile. Not the involuntary thing the face does when someone says something mildly pleasant and social protocol requires a response. I mean the real thing. The kind of laugh that starts in the chest and takes over before you have any say in the matter. The kind that surprises you. The kind that, in the weeks after losing someone you loved for 41 years, feels almost like a betrayal, and then, about 2 seconds in, feels like oxygen. It happened 11 days after the funeral, and the person responsible for it was my neighbor Norma. I'll tell you about Norma in a moment, because Norma requires some context. Specifically, the kind of context that explains why a 70-year-old retired emergency physician who has maintained composure in situations that would reduce most people to rubble can be completely undone by a 5'2" woman from Cleveland who has no concept of appropriate timing and apparently no internal mechanism that filters thoughts before they become words. But before I get to Norma, I need to tell you something about grief, about what it actually looks like from the inside. Because I spent 40 years watching people grieve from the outside, from the professional distance of a physician in an emergency department, observing the specific shapes that loss takes in other people's bodies and faces and behavior. And I had absolutely no preparation for what it looks like from where I am now, from inside, from the house, from the side of the bed that used to have someone in it. What the first weeks actually look like. Nobody tells you this part. People prepare you for grief the way they prepare you for a lot of things. With the general shape of it, the broad outline, the version that can be communicated in the time available at a funeral reception, or a sympathy card. They tell you it comes in waves. They tell you to take it one day at a time. They tell you that time heals, which is true in the way that most true things are. Incompletely true, contextually true. True in a way that doesn't fully capture what the actual experience is like when you are inside it. What nobody told me, what I was not prepared for, despite 40 years of professional proximity to loss, was the specific, ordinary, completely mundane texture of it, not the large moments. The large moments I had braced for. The first holidays, the anniversary, the milestones that arrive wearing the specific clothes of absence. Those I had been warned about had been building internal scaffolding to manage. It was the small things that got me. The second mug. For 41 years, I made 2 cups of coffee every morning. Not because it was a ritual I had consciously built. It was simply what happened. Margaret drank coffee, I drank coffee. There were 2 cups. And on the morning of the 4th day after she died, I stood in my kitchen and made 2 cups of coffee before I understood what I had done. I stood there looking at the second cup for a long time. That is what grief actually looks like, not the dramatic version. The version where your hands make a second cup of coffee because they have not yet received the information that the second cup is no longer needed. The television. Margaret and I had a program we watched on Tuesday evenings. Nothing sophisticated. A show she had been watching for years before I started watching it with her, and that I had arrived at with the particular begrudging enjoyment of a man who pretended not to be entertained and was obviously entertained. We watched it together on Tuesdays. The first Tuesday after she died, the program came on at its regular time. I turned it off after 4 minutes. The second Tuesday, I didn't turn it on at all. The third Tuesday, I sat in my chair and watched the full episode alone. And when it ended, I sat in the silence for a long time before I got up. The garden. I told you about the garden before. The tomatoes. The back porch. The July afternoon that was the best afternoon of our marriage. Margaret loved the garden. She didn't tend it. She appreciated it from a distance, from the porch, from the kitchen window. The tending was mine, and in the weeks after she died, I could not make myself go out there. Not because it was painful in any identifiable way, because it felt purposeless, because the garden had been, in some sense I hadn't fully articulated, something I maintained for her enjoyment, and without her to enjoy it, the engine that drove the maintenance had stalled. This is what the grief literature calls loss of meaning. The small daily activities that derived their significance from the person they were connected to, that lose their reason for being when that person is gone. It is one of the quieter forms of loss, and one of the most pervasive. It gets into everything. Claire called every day. Daniel came over twice a week. They were attentive children, and I was grateful for them. And I was also, if I am being fully honest, not very good company in those weeks. I answered their questions. I assured them I was managing. I ate the meals they brought and confirmed that I was sleeping, and thanked them for the checking in. And then I sat alone in the house and missed Margaret in a way that was so specific and so constant that it had become, by the end of the third week, simply the ambient condition of the air inside the building. That was where I was, on the 11th day after the funeral. And then Norma knocked on the door. Norma, an explanation. Norma Jean Kowalski has lived next door to me for 22 years. She is 70 years old. She is 5 feet 2 inches tall and has the energy of someone who was built at a different voltage than the rest of us. She is originally from Cleveland, which she mentions with a frequency and a pride that suggests Cleveland is something people ordinarily need to be reminded of, rather than something they would be likely to forget. She was married to a man named Dennis for 38 years. Dennis died 4 years ago. Heart attack, sudden without warning, the kind that doesn't negotiate. Norma handled this the way Norma handles most things, by talking about it constantly, loudly, and with a dark humor about mortality that most people find startling, until they understand that it is, for Norma, a form of love, and not a deficit of it. She and Margaret were friends, not the kind of friends who spent every afternoon together. Margaret was quieter, more contained, more careful with her words than Norma could conceive of being, but the kind of friends who understood each other across a significant difference in temperament. Margaret once told me that she found Norma restful, which I found baffling, given that Norma's defining characteristic is that she is the opposite of restful. Margaret explained, she means everything she says, and she never makes you guess. For a woman who had spent years married to a man whose interior life was largely inaccessible, I understood why that was restful. Norma had been, in the weeks since Margaret died, doing what Norma does, which is to say, showing up. Not with the carefully managed distance that most neighbors maintain in the presence of grief, the polite checking in that respects the bereaved person's space. Norma does not respect space. Norma arrives at the door with a casserole dish and an opinion, and stays until she has delivered both. In the 11 days since the funeral, she had brought a tuna noodle casserole, a pot of chili, something she described as a Polish dessert that turned out to be entirely bread, a lemon pound cake, and on one memorable occasion, a plant. When I asked what kind of plant it was, she said she wasn't sure, but that it had looked cheerful at the store. It was currently sitting on my kitchen counter, looking less cheerful than advertised. I had not, in those 11 days, laughed once. On the morning of the 11th day, she knocked at 8:15. I know it was 8:15 because I had been sitting at the kitchen table since 6:30 with the newspaper I had not read and the 1 cup of coffee I had made deliberately that morning. Having decided that making 2 cups was no longer something I was going to do, I opened the door. Norma was standing on my porch holding a covered dish and wearing an expression that I can only describe as aggressively sympathetic. The look of a person who has decided that what you need is company and has declined to make this decision negotiable. She said, "I made pierogies. Don't argue with me about the pierogies." She came in, set the dish on the counter next to the cheerful plant, and looked at me with the specific evaluating look she gets when she is about to say something that most people would spend considerable time deciding not to say. She said, "You look terrible, Ed. You look like a man who has been sitting in a house thinking about being sad instead of actually being sad. Those are two different things, and one of them is worse for you." I told her I wasn't sure I understood the distinction. She said, "Being sad is when you cry and feel it and let it move through you. Thinking about being sad is when you sit at a kitchen table at 8 in the morning staring at a newspaper you haven't read and making one cup of coffee like you're practicing for a life you don't actually want." I looked at the 1 cup of coffee on the table. She said, "Margaret would have made you make 2 cups. She would have said it was wasteful to only make 1. I said, "That is not something Margaret would have said." She said, "No, you're right. That's something I'm saying, but I'm saying it in her spirit." There was a pause. Then she said, "Also, I think that plant is dying." I looked at the plant. She said, "I probably should have gotten you a fake one. Dennis always said I couldn't keep a plant alive if it was made of plastic." He was right. He was right about almost nothing else, but he was right about that. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'll replace it with a fake one. Do you have a preference for fake plant type? I'm thinking something tropical. I said, "Norma, I don't have a preference for fake plant type." She said, "A succulent then. They're very in right now." Margaret would have liked a succulent, very architectural. She had good taste. She said this with the complete sincerity of a person who has just resolved a difficult problem. Turned back to the pierogies and began describing how to reheat them in a way that suggested she had grave doubts about my ability to operate a stove. And somewhere between the dying plant and the succulent recommendation and the detailed instructions for reheating pierogies delivered to a man who had spent 40 years in emergency medicine, something happened. I laughed. Not politely. Not the social response. The real thing, starting somewhere in the chest and arriving without permission, the way laughter does when it has been held back long enough that the body decides it is no longer waiting for the mind to give the okay. Norma looked at me. She said, "There you are." Just that, 3 words, with the specific satisfaction of a person who came to a door with a covered dish and a mission and has successfully completed both. There you are. I have thought about those 3 words many times since that morning. What that laugh taught me, and what it took me too long to understand. I want to spend some time on this, because I think it contains something important. Something that goes beyond one laugh in one kitchen on one morning, 11 days after a funeral. The laugh arrived because Norma was entirely, stubbornly, constitutionally present. Not carefully present, not present in the managed, appropriate, sensitive to the situation way that most people are present around grief. Walking the careful line between showing they care and not impinging on the space the grieving person is supposed to need. Norma does not walk careful lines. Norma walks directly through the middle of whatever is happening and says what she sees with the full confidence of someone who has decided that honesty, even clumsy honesty, is a form of respect. You look terrible, Ed. You're thinking about being sad instead of actually being sad. Those are 2 different things. She was right. In the 11 days between the funeral and the pierogies, I had been conducting, mostly alone, a very thorough and very internal process of thinking about my grief rather than experiencing it. I had been managing it the way I managed difficult things professionally, with distance, with analysis, with the careful maintenance of a functional external surface that reassured my children I was coping, and left the actual thing largely untouched. Norma walked through the door, took one look at me, and named it in about 4 sentences. This is what full presence does. Not the managed kind, the real kind. The kind that sees clearly because it is not protecting itself from what it sees. The kind that says the thing because it trusts the other person enough to receive it. The kind that brings pierogies and a dying plant and accidentally says something true about succulents and makes a man laugh for the first time in 11 days. I have been talking in previous videos about presence, about the cost of not being present for Margaret across 30 years of marriage, about the man with $4 billion whose son didn't pick up the phone, about Walter, the football coach, who held "I'm proud of you" in his chest for 3 decades before it finally came out in a hospital room. What Norma gave me that morning was the other side of that same truth. She showed me what full presence looks like when it is actually happening, when it is not an intention or a resolution, but a lived practice, when someone decides to show up. Not with the perfect words, not with the correct emotional register, not with the carefully prepared consolation that the situation calls for, but with everything they have, which in Norma's case is 5'2" of Cleveland-born, Dennis widowed, wrong plant buying, pierogies forcing humanity that does not know how to be anywhere except all the way in. The laugh was not incidental. The laugh was the result of being seen, of being in the presence of someone who looked at me clearly and told me what they saw and trusted me to be able to hear it. That is a specific kind of gift. And it is, I have come to understand, the same gift that I was asking you to give the people in your life in every conversation we have had on this channel. Not the performance of care, the actual thing, the presence that is willing to say, "You look terrible, Ed." The presence that brings a dying plant because it looks cheerful and doesn't pretend it didn't die. The presence that stays in the room, in the actual room with full attention, committed to the conversation, even when the conversation is not comfortable. Norma gave me that every Tuesday for the next 4 months. She came every Tuesday with food I didn't request and conversation I didn't always want, and the specific, impossible to replicate comfort of a person who has also lost someone and who therefore does not need the loss to be explained or contextualized or managed for their benefit. She knew. Not everything. She didn't know Margaret the way I knew Margaret, but she knew the shape of it. The second cup problem, the Tuesday program, the garden that had lost its engine. She knew because she had her own version of every single one of those things when Dennis died. On the 3rd Tuesday she came, she told me about the first time she laughed after Dennis died. It was at the funeral, during the eulogy, she said. The pastor said something about Dennis being a man of few words, and I laughed out loud because Dennis talked more than any human being I have ever encountered in my entire life, including me, which is really saying something. And everyone turned and looked at me, and I thought, Dennis would have loved this. He would have said finally, the last word. She was laughing as she told me this. The real kind, the chest kind. And I laughed with her. It was the second time in 3 weeks. Progress. What grief teaches about living. The instruction I didn't expect. I want to tell you something about grief that I did not read in any of the books, and that I was not told by any of the people who checked in on me in the weeks and months after Margaret died. Grief is the most honest inventory I have ever taken. more honest than the relationship inventory I have described in previous conversations. The accounting of what you gave and what you held back, and whether the people who mattered knew they mattered. Grief goes deeper than that. Grief shows you, with a precision that no other experience can match, exactly what you valued. Not what you thought you valued, not what you told yourself you valued. What you actually, functionally, at the level of behavior and habit and daily choice, valued. Because grief is the absence of what was there, and absence reveals structure. When Margaret died, the things I grieved immediately, the things that produced the specific physical ache of loss in the first hours and days, were not the things I would have predicted. Not the major events, not the big life moments, the second cup of coffee, the Tuesday program, the particular way she laughed at something she found genuinely funny, which was a laugh that started quietly and then got away from her. She tried to be contained about it, and she couldn't. And the losing of the containment was the part that always made me smile. I grieved those things before I grieved the larger losses, because those things were the daily substance of her. They were what she was made of at the level of Tuesday morning and Thursday evening, and the ordinary run of a shared life. And in grieving them, I understood something about what I had been doing for 40 years. I had been living in a house with someone who was, at the level of ordinary daily Tuesday, extraordinary. Who made the ordinary days something worth noticing. Who was, even in the moments I was not paying full attention, especially in those moments, exactly herself, exactly present, exactly the person I had stopped in a Pittsburgh corridor to watch through a slightly open door in 1979. The grief showed me that, not in a way I could have seen before. Not while she was there. When someone is present in your life, you look at them the way you look at a wall. You see it when you are specifically attending to it, but you stop seeing it when it is simply always there. It becomes the background. Margaret became the background, and the grief pulled her into the foreground with a clarity that the 41 years of living alongside her had never produced. I understood, in those weeks and months, that the ordinary days were not the backdrop to the life. They were the life. The Tuesday evenings were not the space between the important events. They were the important events. The second cup of coffee was not a minor domestic detail. It was the daily evidence of a life shared with another person, and it deserved to be received as such while it was happening. I had received it as background for too long. The grief was, among other things, the most complete possible lesson in paying attention. I say this not to add to the weight of regret. I have sat with that weight, and I know its texture, and I am not asking you to pick it up unnecessarily. I say it because I think it is the most useful thing grief offered me. The instruction underneath the loss. Pay attention now, not to the milestones, not to the events worth photographing, to the second cup, to the Tuesday program, to the laugh that starts quietly and then gets away from the person who is trying to contain it. Those are the things you will grieve the most specifically when they are gone, which means they are the things most worth attending to while they are still there. Norma in the garden, and what she said that she probably shouldn't have. About 6 weeks after Margaret died, Norma appeared at my back door on a Saturday morning while I was standing on the porch looking at the garden. The garden had gone partially to neglect in the weeks since the fall. Not completely. I had done some basic maintenance, the kind that prevents irreversible damage, but the attention I normally gave it had not been there. The engine problem I described had not fully resolved. Norma looked at the garden. Then she looked at me. Then, back at the garden, she said, "Ed, the tomatoes look how you look." I said, I'm going to need you to explain that, she said. Alive but not thriving. Present but not engaged. Dennis's tomatoes looked like that in the summer before he died. I should have paid more attention to the tomatoes. They were trying to tell me something. I said, Norma, I don't think the tomatoes were trying to tell you anything, she said. You don't know that. Plants are very sensitive. My cousin in Akron talks to her plants, and they're enormous. She has a fern the size of a Labrador. I said, your cousin in Akron talks to her plants. She said, every day. She tells them about her day. Her kids think she's lost her mind, but the fern is thriving. So, I said, I am not going to talk to my tomatoes, she said. I didn't say you had to talk to them. I'm just saying, maybe get back in the garden. Margaret liked this garden. She used to sit on this porch and watch you in it, and she looked. She stopped. She looked out at the garden for a moment. She looked happy. She looked like a woman watching something she loved. There was a silence. Then Norma said, also, I think you have aphids, the small one in the corner. You're going to want to deal with that. I went back into the garden the following morning. I did not talk to the tomatoes. I want to be clear about that. I am a retired physician, and I have standards. But I was in the garden, and the garden was being tended, and the engine was running again. Not at the same power it had run at before, but running. The aphids, for the record, were dealt with. That same week, Norma came back on Thursday. Not her usual day, but Norma operates on a schedule that is entirely internal and non-negotiable, and she arrived with what she called a sympathy succulent. It was in a small terracotta pot with a handwritten tag that said, in her handwriting, this one is fake. It cannot die, unlike the last one. Sorry about the last one. I put it on the kitchen windowsill. It is still there. I have looked at it every morning for 2.5 years, and I have thought about what it means to show up for someone, even imperfectly, even with the wrong plant, with the full force of your actual self. There was a Tuesday in the spring, maybe 2 months after the aphid conversation, when Norma came in with a pot of something she called a Slovak spring soup, and told me, without preamble, that she had been going through Dennis's old boxes and found a birthday card he had written her and never given her. It was for a birthday 6 years before he died. She said it was the most beautiful thing he had ever written. She read it to me. 4 sentences. Simple, direct, entirely Dennis. 4 sentences about why he was glad she was his wife. When she finished reading, we both sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, I would give anything if he had just given me the card. He had it written. He had it in his desk. What was he waiting for? I knew what he was waiting for. The same thing everyone waits for. The right moment, the occasion sufficient to justify handing someone a card that says simply and without armor why you are glad they exist. There is no such occasion. The occasion is Tuesday. The occasion is the kitchen table and the Slovak spring soup and the fake succulent on the windowsill. The occasion is always right now. Norma has never once delivered a piece of genuine emotional insight without immediately following it with something so practically specific and tonally mismatched that you don't have time to sit in the feeling. She pivots from the real thing to the aphids without pause, without transition, without any apparent awareness of the whiplash she is producing. I have come to believe this is intentional, not consciously. Norma does not operate with that level of strategic self-awareness, but functionally. She has been around enough loss. Her husband, her parents, a brother she lost young, a best friend from high school she still mentions by name, to understand that grief cannot be sat in indefinitely. that the moment of real contact has to be followed by something that moves the person forward, that the aphids are, in their own way, the medicine. She gives you the true thing, and then she hands you the next small action. You looked happy. She looked like a woman watching something she loved. Deal with the aphids. Get back in the garden. It is not the most sophisticated grief counseling I have ever encountered. It is possibly the most effective. The two things I'm asking you to consider. I want to be direct about what I'm trying to give you in this conversation, because I have been less direct about the practical takeaway than I usually am. And I want to correct that before I lose you to the ordinary demands of a Tuesday afternoon. The first thing is this: if you are in the middle of a loss, any loss, at any stage, any size, I want to give you permission to laugh. Not because the loss isn't real, because it is real, and because laughter does not contradict it. Because the body needs both, the grief and the breath. Because the person you are grieving, if they loved you, would not want the grief to become a permanent prohibition on the rest of what being alive feels like. Margaret would not have wanted 11 days of a man making 1 cup of coffee in a silent house. I know this with complete certainty. She would have sent Norma days earlier if she had any say in the matter. She probably, in some way I don't fully understand and don't need to fully understand, did. Let the laugh come when it comes. Not as a performance of recovery, not as a signal to everyone around you that you are handling it well, just as the thing it is, the breath that grief occasionally allows, the moment of oxygen in a difficult stretch, the evidence that you are still here and still capable of being reached by the ordinary human things. The second thing is about the people in your life who are trying to show up for you. They're probably not doing it perfectly. The people who show up for us in grief rarely do. They bring the wrong plant. They say the tonally mismatched thing. They pivot to the aphids when what they meant to say was something true and tender. And they don't quite know how to land it cleanly. Let them be imperfect. Norma was not the comforter I would have designed for myself. If someone had asked me what I needed in the weeks after Margaret died, she was loud and she was blunt and she brought a dying plant and she told me I looked terrible and she laughed at her husband's funeral and she talked about her cousin in Akron who had a fern the size of a Labrador. She was also in the specific situation of a man who needed to be pulled out of his head and back into the room exactly right. She was the only person in those first weeks who looked at me without the careful, managed distance that grief tends to produce in the people around the grieving person. The distance that is itself a form of abandonment, however kindly intended. Norma did not maintain a careful distance. Norma arrived at my front door at 8:15 with pierogies, and the observation that I looked terrible, and in doing so she told me, in the only language she has available, that she saw me. That she was not afraid of what she saw. That she was going to be there on Tuesday with whatever she'd made, regardless of whether I'd asked for it, for as long as it was needed. That is what showing up actually looks like. It does not look like the perfectly timed, perfectly worded, perfectly calibrated presence that we imagine when we think about what we would want someone to offer us. It looks like a 5'2" woman from Cleveland with a dying plant and no internal filter, standing at your door at 8:15 because she decided you needed company and declined to make it negotiable. Let the Normas in your life show up. And if you are the Norma in someone else's life, if you are the person who shows up with the wrong thing and says the slightly wrong thing and pivots to the aphids when you meant to say something beautiful, keep going. The showing up is the thing, not the perfection of the showing up. The Tuesday is the thing, not the graduation, not the milestone, not the event worth photographing. The Tuesday, every time. Norma was here last Tuesday, and something happened. I want to tell you about last Tuesday. Norma came at her usual time. She has normalized the Tuesday visits to the point where I have stopped being surprised by them, and have started, I'll admit, putting the water on before she arrives. She brought what she described as an experimental soup, which turned out to be a regular potato soup, with the addition of something she called a secret ingredient, and refused to identify. It was good. I didn't ask again. We sat at the kitchen table. We talked, the way we have talked on Tuesdays for going on 3 years now. About her grandchildren, about my garden, about the news, about Dennis, about Margaret, in the easy way of two people for whom the absent ones are still a regular presence at the table. And then Norma said something that has been sitting with me all week. She said, "Ed, have you gone through all of Margaret's things yet?" I told her that I had gone through most of them. Her clothes, her personal items, her side of the closet. Claire had helped. It had taken a day, and it had been the kind of day that I will not describe in detail, because the detail is not the point, and some things belong to the private record of a life rather than the public one. Norma said, "What about her desk?" I was quiet for a moment. Margaret had a desk, a small writing desk in the room off the hallway that had been hers for 30 years. Her room, her space, the place where she handled the correspondence and the household records. And I always assumed whatever private thinking required a pen and a quiet room. I had not gone through the desk. I told Norma I hadn't gotten to the desk yet. She nodded slowly with the specific expression she gets when she is holding something back, which, given that Norma holds almost nothing back, means it is something significant. She said, "Margaret gave me something to give you. About 2 weeks before she died, she handed it to me and she said, 'Give this to Ed when you think the time is right.' I looked at her. She said, 'I've been sitting with it for almost 3 years, Ed. I think the time is right.' She reached into her bag and placed an envelope on the kitchen table between us. It was a plain white envelope, my name on the front in Margaret's handwriting. Her handwriting, the specific, neat, slightly forward-leaning cursive of a woman who had learned to write in a generation that took handwriting seriously and had maintained the practice her entire life. I looked at it for a long time. Norma said, "I'll go. You don't need me here for this." For once, she was right about the timing. She gathered her coat and her bag, and she patted my hand once, firmly, the Norma version of tenderness, and she went out the back door. I sat alone at the kitchen table with my name in Margaret's handwriting. I have not opened it yet. I've been sitting with it for 6 days. I don't know exactly what I'm waiting for. Maybe for the right morning. Maybe for the courage that I seem to have in most situations, except this one. Maybe for the part of me that knows, with complete certainty, that whatever is in that envelope is going to change something, is going to say something that needs to be received carefully, in the right state of mind, with enough room around it to hold what it contains. I'll open it next week, and I'll tell you what it says. Before you go, I want to leave you with one thing from this conversation. Not the grief. I've given you enough of that across 5 videos now. Something smaller and more useful. I want you to think about the Norma in your life. The person who shows up without being asked. Who brings the wrong thing? Who says the true thing awkwardly and then pivots to the aphids before you have time to process it? Who talks too much and reads the room imperfectly and has been known to laugh at funerals and offer strong opinions on fake plant varieties? Who shows up on Tuesday, every Tuesday? That person is one of the most valuable people in your life. And there is a very good chance that you have been treating them as a fixture rather than a gift. As someone who is simply there, the way the wall is there, without fully registering what their presence costs them and what it gives you. Tell them, not with a speech, not with a formal acknowledgement. Just The next time they show up with the wrong thing, say, "I'm glad you come." Or, "I don't say this enough, but I notice." Or just, "Thank you for Tuesday." They will probably say something inappropriate in response. That is fine. That is Norma. That is the whole thing. The showing up is the thing. In the comments, tell me about your Norma, the person in your life who shows up imperfectly and consistently and without being asked. I want to hear about them. And next week, I'll tell you what Margaret wrote. My name is Dr. Edward Carver. I'll see you then.